Environmental issues have several dimensions.
The important thing is that the industry wants skills and the competencies.
That is, how can we build ethical, moral citizens?
Multidisciplinary knowledge required in solving complex problems.
Good morning to all. Welcome to the NEP Dialogues. I am Dr. Chetan Singhai, Special Officer, Karnataka State Higher Education Council. Today we are with Dr. Vikas, an expert in the domain of project-based learning. Welcome to you, Dr. Vikas, for this conversation. As you are aware that the nation is now implementing the national education policy in a mission mode. Among many reforms that NEP recommends, one of the major reform is about how do we engage in learner-centric approach or the student-centric approach in our higher education system. I'm just curious to know from you and for our viewers that what are your insights on the overall origin of this project-based learning and its concept, if you could share with us.
It's very interesting that you mentioned about student-centric learning processes, and in fact project-based learning is one of it, and it's not originated now. Its origin dates back in 1968. If I remember correctly, it's the 1968 McMaster University which has first developed its first model where it started for medicine courses, right? And in medicine courses they started with a problem-based learning. But nowadays problem-based learning, project-based learning, these are the terms which are interchangeably used. So especially if you are starting defining problem-based learning, it starts with the problem. The model which is developed based on the problems encountered by the patients. And whenever any doctor asks to the patients, so what is your problem? So he started thinking about the solution of that particular problem. So that is the origin of a PBL. Now we also consider this as a project-based learning, because especially in domains like engineering, pharmacy or professional education, the project is one of the very popular term. So that's why, for simplicity, this higher education institution has taken project-based learning as a term for problem-based learning.
But that's an interesting thought, because there is a lot of skewness in the overall higher education ecosystem towards professional education and also creating silos with the so-called non-professional education setup. So how do we integrate this project-based learning? First of all, do you think it is critical that we bring that experience of project-based learning in these courses that you mentioned to a multidisciplinary environment like social sciences and so on and so forth?
To a certain extent, yes, because the way the PBL has been defined, it is defined in the principles. Because it's not having a clear cut as a framework, but it has clearly defined principles. And if these principles are satisfied, you can literally implement problem-based or project-based learning approaches in any of the disciplines. And over to that, the starting point of any project-based learning pedagogy starts with identifying the clearly defined problems. Sometimes it is ill-structured, sometimes it is well-defined, in a both way, because it goes to the different continuum. If you define the problem very clearly and then explicitly tell the students, okay, you do this kind of a work, so this becomes in a project-based learning domain. But on the other hand, if the problem is defined by the students, identified by the students, they analyze the problem and then cut down towards the small objectives, then it becomes more problem-based, project-based learning approach.
I'm very happy to hear that you are referring to students multiple times.
Yeah.
I think that's very critical, and that
because
kind of
you
hits
mentioned about student-centric learning.
Exactly. That's the fundamental principle of the NEP, to propagate this thought of how students should be in the center of the learning process. But now at this juncture, do you think that there is a shift from the traditional memory-based learning, route learning to sort of problem-based learning, project-based learning? How this transition do you think should institutions sort of reconcile?
Actually, good question, Chetan. Because I am also a teacher and I have been teaching since last 20 years. I have seen that the way we have been teaching to the students since last maybe 50 to 80 years, that the students focus on the grades and the teachers will focus also on the grades. The irony is that the both focuses on a skill, grades. The important thing is that the industry wants skills and the competencies, the ability to apply whatever you have learned. And unfortunately, in a rote learning, it doesn't happen. And PBL finds itself is a very good option to replace rote learning which is being taught. Having said so, but we need to be very specific while changing from rote learning towards the PBL. There has to be have some change process, and if this change process is being handled properly, we'll get the outcomes which are desired through national education policy.
So I think you have laid out the concept of how do we integrate, but it will be very helpful to our viewers who are basically the primary actors in higher education and otherwise. It would be very helpful to provide us a model of its practical sort of implications and any institution that you would like to refer to in order to understand how it is actually practiced, this concept that you rightly mentioned.
There are various models because it's all depends on what kind of outcomes you require, what kind of a student's profile you are having, it's your administrative structure, academic structure, and based on that you can develop different models. If I talk about the international models, there are international models like Aalborg University itself, which is a university model, Denmark, situated in Denmark. Then we have different acronyms for PBL, for example, project-led education in UK, because they also have a similar thought processes. If you come back in a national settings in India, when I started my PhD, I first referred to the Chitkara University. Dr. Mantri was one of the important referred her paper. So that was the beginning.
Yeah. So in that, did they have any challenges to implement the PBL in the initial phase? And would you like to kind of throw some light on that?
Yeah, the challenge was that there was not clarity about what is really a PBL is about, and people started implementing the way they wanted. And for me, we need to understand PBL scientifically through its principles, and then execute the designs which can satisfy the principles. And obviously, you can design it according to your, as I already said, according to your culture of education, administrative settings, students' profile, and then you will get the best out of the PBL.
That's true. Yes, yes. So, but at the same time, we are seeing a diversity of institutions in the country. One. Second, we also have diversity in terms of students, not in terms of the intellectual capacities. Each student is in their own self very confident and at the same time very thoughtful about their expectations from the system and also knowledge-wise. Each one has their own strengths. But the diversity of institutions that we have today and the diversity of students' needs given the 21st century, how do you locate yourself in terms of providing insight on PBL as a sort of a possible solution to overcome this? Not to homogenize the system, but at the same time continue to have the heterogeneity, but at the same time how we can link it.
See, you are mentioning to the heterogeneous nature of education culture in India. I totally agree, because one side you have university structures, which is affiliated structures, and in a PBL again we have different models. Like I was mentioning about the Aalborg University. Aalborg University has its own model developed for the universities. There are some institutes like RIT Sakrale or KLE for Hubli. Our university as a Vishwaniketan is an institute which is affiliated, had implemented different models of project-based learning, and that could be good frameworks for people who want to implement PBL in India. So one hand you have a very small framework called as a course level project-based learning. To other round you have a university level project-based learning models. So within this continuum you can implement PBL in any type of the institutions which you are mentioning.
So among the many things, what do you think is the most critical component in the order of priority to prepare ourselves to implement PBL based on this diversity of experience itself? For example, is the faculty development the most important priority, or is it the attitude of the students themselves and other aspects? So how do you organize this thought process for our viewers to engage in implementation effectively while you share the model? But what are those priority areas that they should have the checklist ready for implementation?
Actually, in my opinion, again, I will tell you, through my experience, I found that the teachers are the main actors of these institutions, because many times students are enter into the academic settings and they are groomed, nurtured, and they move out. But who stays there is the faculty members. And if you have faculty members who has been trained on project-based learning, implementing project-based learning for 2-3 years, I think the culture of project-based learning will start in the institutions. That's why I say that the teacher is the first priority. Obviously, the second important actor is the students' mindset to adopt and embrace project-based learning approaches because they are more comfortably placed in a traditional rote learning. And project-based learning moves them from a comforts to a more active learning processes. That is better for them, but somehow we need to tell them that this is for your better future. And if you adopt this change, you will be the most important beneficiaries.
So why I asked that question is, Dr. Vikas, because there is also a perception that project-based learning is a sort of a threat to traditional conceptual-based learning.
Yeah.
Because is it too much of activity and very less of theory and concepts vis-a-vis the outcomes that you envisage? So that is where the issues also, that where the institutions are in a dilemma.
Yeah.
That how do we balance this if we have to, or is it that we need to move towards the PBL way in order to envisage the aspirations of the NEP?
You rightly mentioned, there are some myths related to this. Because why I said it's a myth, because it's not fact. Because we have traditionally very influential models of lecture-based or instruction-based delivery, and now we are talking about project-based learning. So this change has to happen slowly. So initially I will propose it should be a hybrid model, but there is also another myth that there is no teaching available in project-based learning, fundamentals. Let me tell you very frankly, the fundamentals will be always there in project-based learning, but only the component of a teaching, which has to be minimized, which is otherwise taking a lot of time of our curriculum. More than 90% of the time students are listening lectures. In PBL, we have to move from say 50% lecturing and 50% active learning. So that could be one way to start. When once it has been done properly for 2-3 years, then we can slowly move towards shift where the less lecturing and more active learning.
So teachers
pedagogy.
become facilitators.
Yeah.
And not necessarily anchor the whole teaching and learning process and take over that whole process. But I think students are also equal participants to the whole process of learning. But also there is a shift towards outcome-based education, which is a very important component of NEP as well. And I believe that this is also what we have learned from the project-based learning models, and also how do you see the link, particularly in the multidisciplinary environment? How do you see this outcome?
See, there is a definite link.
Yes.
Because when you implement project-based learning, we need to assess the outcomes also. And assessing the outcomes in PBL is always in multidimensional. Because you mentioned about the multidisciplinarity, I first mentioned about the multiple assessment methods, which necessary a formative and summative assessments, which has to be followed in a PBL. Because I believe, because the way you assess your students, the way you evaluate them, accordingly they nurture their teaching, learning ways. So if the assessment is done on a more formative and in a project-based environment, the change will happen. Regarding the multidisciplinarity you mentioned, I believe the nature of the multidisciplinarity comes through the selection of the problems. If the problem is selected in a such a way that you want to promote interdisciplinarity, it is possible. In fact, if the real problems in a PBL are on multidisciplinarity. I can quote some examples also if you would like to. Suppose if a pharmacy industry is looking for a solution, and if engineering students visits to the pharmaceutical industry, so they have to understand the basic natures of the pharmacy, what are the processes, what are the compositions. So that brings the context of a pharmacy in engineering. While the engineering students learn pharmacy, they bring the context of engineering into the solutions. So that way the multidisciplinary is taken care of.
So but when we move towards this whole transition from summative assessment to formative assessment, as also you rightly mentioned, as NEP also envisages that. So this shift is currently very mechanical. But how do you make it organic? And you think again, I'll come back to some of the points you mentioned, maybe you would like to link it to this, how project-based learning and linked to the OBE can enhance formative assessment in a practical sense, in the sense, practical meaning that institutions can actually implement them, given that they have the autonomy to engage with assessment-related reforms. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I will try to bring certain examples here, because if you are talking about outcome-based education, we have defined explicitly outcome-based education in the form of attributes. In the form of outcomes.
You mean graduate attributes?
Graduate attributes. Okay. And these are the 12 attributes which you are talking about, especially if you go to the engineering domain. I will take an example of a problem solving maybe example of a teamwork and a communication. And these are the three important skills which everybody want to assess.
Irrespective of any course or program,
Irrespective
yes.
of any course.
Very critical as life skill and soft skill also. Yes.
Yeah, and then if you really want to assess this and relate to the outcome based education, how you do it? That's the challenge. And very often teachers goes for different types of assessments. I will explain you. For example, you mentioned about the organic nature of assessment. For example, if I want to assess the teamwork, how a teacher can assess while he is sitting in his cabin? He cannot assess teamwork while he is sitting in a cabin. So he has to be with the team. And while the team is working on some kind of a projects, some kind of work they are doing, if the teacher is there, he can assess how the teachers are actually involving in a problem solving process. At the same time, they are working in a teamwork. At the same time, teacher has to facilitate students to move towards the goals which I have decided as a team. And how much they are moving towards that is the assessment which teachers has to carry while involving in the process. At the same time, the problems are getting solved as the students move from the initial part of the problem solving to the latter part of the problem solving. So whole journey has to be recorded. And that is the organic nature of the assessment in a PBL itself. And when you have a milestones, and if you check the milestones which are done or achieved by the students during the problem solving process, then you can design the assessments at the different milestones. So during the process you have milestones which need to be achieved, so this becomes a formative in nature, and towards the end you have everything taken care, right from the beginning to the end you make a summative in nature. So in my opinion, if you do the formative properly and very strongly, summative will be again it will be different outcomes, something which you are really planned.
That's true.
That outcomes will be more tangible, and that is the beauty of project-based learning.
But what intrigues me while you are speaking is because now that I am sort of curious, because you said there are different types of institutions, and you are coming from an affiliating college system, which majority of the stakeholders in higher education feel that affiliation systems are so bounded by rules, regulations, and a lot of restrictions in terms of reforming, especially curricular assessment related. But I believe you have already done that.
Yeah.
So how did you overcome this perceived set of barriers that people tend to think about in the sector of higher education? So maybe you could share that, because that is very reassuring for our viewers, because majority of them are very keen.
And that's an important question also, because you mentioned rightly, the affiliation of the university brings a rigidity into the system. But I believe, because I talk to many university higher authorities, the university never bounds any teachers to do something in a bounded nature. They have provided enough flexibility. It's the ability of a teacher to identify that flexibility and find the space to implement it. And that is what precisely we have done. We are also affiliated with the University of Mumbai, but University of Mumbai has tangibly defined everything as a course learning objectives. The contents are already been defined, the experiments already been
Which
defined.
is the case with most affiliating universities.
Universities. But there is always a scope to find a nature of a problem which suits to your course, and then you bring the problem into the academia. The students are learning the courses. The problem which brings the context, students and the problem encounter with each other, and they learn what is being written already by the university curriculum. So the way of learning happens while solving the problem rather than listening from the teacher. Obviously the teacher will play a critical role, because the content has to be given to the transacted to the students. So the fundamentals which is being taught by the teacher in a class has to be applied on a problem. So the application of the problem, application of a knowledge learned from the class, from the teacher, is applied on a problem. And then you see the outcomes, which is in the form of again the assessment. You take some project presentations and then add some attachments toward your objectives. So this way you can relate.
So you are saying that the content and the design is already been provided, but the delivery is where we have utmost autonomy as teachers, and that is in the case of affiliating system. But I'm sure on the other hand we have institutions who are already autonomous in terms of not only the design, delivery, but also assessment. So they are already there to implement this sort of reform. But affiliation system, I'm very happy to know that and also it's very reassuring that it is feasible, because that's mostly the number of institutions who are affiliating are very high. So in this regard, just to ensure that we are going in the direction to what we would like our viewers to also take home this thought process. In addition to all these institutional level challenges, Coming to structural aspects, that is in terms of regulatory reforms.
Yeah.
So you have been engaging with various regulatory bodies as a member of an institution.
Yeah.
So what are your sort of recommendations that how these regulatory entities ought to engage with making PBL a reality?
Yeah. If I take the question correctly,
Yeah.
the mostly in earlier days, the regulatory body was focusing more on input-based structures. Now that I can see the shift from the input-based structure to the more outcome-based structures, because the promotion of getting accredited, promotion of getting the understanding of the best practices, getting collations of different network institutions. So these are the very important initiatives. And I believe I have also shared my one of the best practice to the higher authorities. And that collaboration of different institutions as well as the collection of the best practices brings the holistic change. And that is the holistic change which the National Education Policy is also referring to, because the environment of education has to be changed towards the holistic education. And that is, I think, regulatory bodies are doing wonderful in this regard. With due respect, I still believe there is a scope of improvement in a different.
No, change is inevitable.
Change is
so
inevitable.
I'm sure there are.
One point I would like to add is the flexibility.
Flexibility. Okay.
The flexibility to the teachers and flexibility for the students to take new courses, design new courses, and the credit-based system. That is the one point which I forgot to mention. So credit-based system actually help many institutions to incorporate the different teaching learning practices. I believe if you have a credits to the projects in the framework, it will be wonderful change will bring into the any kind of a curriculum. Which you mentioned.
Actually, I'll come to the credits part. It is very interesting because that is now with the NEP coming in, there's a lot of thought process. But just a step before that is that once we are talking about regulatory reforms, because why I wanted to know more on this, because you are on the field in the sense an institution engaging in delivery of curriculum. On the other hand, there are certain reforms which NEP envisages with the regulatory framework. For example, subsuming most of our professional standard setting bodies into one meta body called as the Higher Education Commission of India, under that the National Higher Education Regulatory Authority, which is on the anvil. Now these changes are also happening, and I think in a way, as you said, the micro and the macro have to come together and make it more meaningful for all these students. So coming to the credits part, so as an affiliating university, you mentioned that most of the content design is given to you. I'm sure the credits are defined. On the other hand, there are institutions who are free to design their credit structures and so on and so forth. So how do you see in these two instances of engaging with OBE, PBL and the credits point that you wanted to highlight?
Yeah, first I will talk about the first context of your question. It's bringing the approaches from the top down and bottom up. It's both are required for changing any system, education system. And we are being a very big education system. The top down approach is helping to become a more regulations, and the bottom up approach is bringing more practices. And the merger goes to a very positive side of implementation of national education policy. The credit system, which I believe has not been implemented very properly in India, which I believe, the flexibility which credits offers, which I take from my experiences. If you studied something in one of the university, and if you can transfer that credits to another university, that is more a credit transfer system which has been followed by the developed countries. We actually started with a very positive note that there should be some credit systems should be available. Credits are defined by the universities. The availability of the credits, availability of courses is wide. Students can have a choice now. That's a very good beginning. And that choice of the institutions also. That is the next stage actually. I would like to refer here. Suppose if I found there is a very fantastic laboratory in one of the university, and I want to stay there for 3 months or 4 months, and I want to earn some credits, and if my university or my institute accepts that credits in my degree, that will be a wonderful change, will bring in a credit system. Another point of credits is the which I would like to mention is the more on assessment of the credits, because the credits now are defined based on the number of hours you spent. Maybe in the laboratories or maybe in the classrooms. Yes. But rather the credit system has to be based on the number of hours spent by the students doing something.
That's true.
So that is the one way you can go to change in the credit system.
Very nicely aligns to again the NEP, because there are very important points that NEP makes, including the aspect of curricular, co-curricular, extracurricular.
Yeah.
This nomenclature itself should now subsume into everything as curricular, not to make it very boring by bringing the extracurricular, co-curricular, but
Yeah.
valuing that time and effort put in by the student or the learner. That's one hand. The other is the credits part that you rightly mentioned again, Dr. Vikas, is the way we actually look at credits as a unit today
Yeah.
of students, who gather those as part of their learning experience, and it aligns with the our current regulations of academic bank of credits, national higher education qualification for framework, multiple entry and exit.
Yeah.
So all these things are also now becoming a reality
yeah.
as NEP had envisaged. So I think this is the right moment to look into this. So to communicate to viewers in the end, it will be very helpful that if you can share a very insightful message to all of them, that what is the importance or significance of PBL in the 21st century, as we have been talking through, maybe as a sort of a summary point, that if you would like to share a message to them.
Yeah. Thank
to
you,
our
Chetan,
viewers.
for
Yes.
yeah. See, again, PBL, which I refer now, is a problem-based and project-based work. It starts with identifying the clearly and ill-structured problems, bringing that problems into the context of the education, and then let the students encounter with that problems, let them learn, give a flexibility. Once they have this flavor understood by them that if I learn in this environment, I am learning better. So that ownership of solving the problem, working in a team, and communicating the issues and the problems which is encountered while solving it brings the holistic nature of education. And that's where the pedagogical change should happen towards the implementation of national education policy. And this is a very wonderful change which I am experiencing personally, because I have been practicing project-based learning implementations last 10 years. And let me tell you, the students are very, very happy in this pedagogical change. Many a times we found that whether it has been accepted by the teachers or not, the teachers are also very happily accepting it. The most important change which I found in my teachers is that the capacity, because they have moved to the next level. They have moved to the next level of capacity, because they can mentor the students very nicely, because they have done some project work by themselves. Forget about the educational background, because it brings more teachers in mentoring, and they have more wider scope of implementation in education institution. With this note, I believe we should go for student-centric learning processes like PBL for implementation of national education policy.
Dr. Vikas, thank you so much. It has been a great sort of conversation with you, because one, I'm sure that our viewers have really enjoyed and learnt a lot of important concepts, but definitely I'm your first learner, you can call it, because it's a great conversation. Thank you.
Thank you
Dr.
very much.
Vikas.
Thank you.